share.
Perfect. Good morning, everybody. Jeff Robbins, Chair of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. I'm welcoming you to Friday, day 5 of the COGCC Mission Change Rulemaking. We are allowing folks to get into our rulemaking via Zoom, so we're going to give it another minute or so to let everybody zoom in, and then we'll get started. All right, it looks like we have 77 participants. We started out with like 300, so we have a little war of attrition going on here, but that's okay. That's still a great number. We're excited to have everybody with us. At this point, I would turn to Hearings Officer Larson, who just turned herself off, to take the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Boag.
Here.
Commissioner Gonzalez.
Here.
Commissioner McGowan.
Here.
Commissioner Mesner.
Here.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Here.
Commissioner Putnam.
Here.
Commissioner Robbins.
Here.
Mr. Chair, you have 7 out of 7 commissioners present.
Great. Okay. So we are in deliberation at this point on the 300 series, which is the first series of our rulemaking. I would have the record reflect that we are on time. We got through all of the party testimony, the party closing statements. We got through a significant bucket of deliberation yesterday. We have 3 hours this morning set aside for deliberation on 300. And then we will move directly into our next series, which is the 500, or the sort of procedures, rules of process series. At the risk of doing something that may sound silly, I just want to give commissioners a chance to sort of opine about where we are, if there was anything that you wanted to speak about from yesterday before we move into today's deliberations. Maybe just sort of open it up real quick. I do not want to dawdle here, but we all had a chance to sit back and reflect last night. Do we have any commissioners that have any thoughts about where we are, where we're going, where we've been before we move forward into today's bucket? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I appreciate the chance to kind of review some of the things we talked about yesterday. And as I was noodling on things last night, I think one of the things that came back into my mind was this concept of utilizing commissioners as liaisons or facilitators in within local communities. And I'd like to revisit that at some point. I'd like to stake that flag. I don't think we need to rehash it necessarily today, but I think that there's incredible value to basically taking the top echelon of the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission and making them available to participate and to facilitate conversations on the ground within communities around the state, in some of the difficult conversations. And I'm not sure it's necessary to utilize them in every application. And certainly I would not want to see a commissioner take the place of a staff person and the amount of knowledge that's available in a staff person. But certainly I would like to see us on the ground within communities, getting involved in some of these conversations, because I think that's a really important part of our new role as professional commissioners. And so I'd like to just reconsider that conversation at some point in the future and see if there's not a way that we can utilize each of us. And I think it does a couple of things. One, I think it really gives us an opportunity to get to know the communities around the state. and to be to create those relationships, because I think that's important. You know, it's hard to create relationships sitting in an office in Denver. I think it's important that we get around the state and get involved with the different communities, you know, that are you know, working with oil and gas operations. And so I just thought I'd bring that topic up.
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. You know, I had this idea and I had not sort of fully vetted it out. I think sort of putting a flag down and thinking about it later does make some sense. I think there's some value there. And so I also do not think it's part of a rule. I think that's more of kind of a guidance or guidelines or how we do business, et cetera. So do other commissioners have comments about Commissioner Messner's idea here? Otherwise, we can put a flag in the ground and make sure we get back to it. Commissioner Donjapa, you're leaning forward again.
You're finding my tell. Yeah, so I appreciate the clarification from Commissioner Messner about it wouldn't take the place of, you know, staff or their expertise in these instances. I guess, yeah, I would be willing to discuss that further. I like the reasons that Commissioner Messner brought forward. I think in a purely liaison kind of carrying information back and forth type role could be useful, but I guess the concern I would just flag is that if in certain instances they need somebody, you know, for a hearing or you know, where they're discussing kind of the next step, then maybe we would need to be accompanied by staff or have, you know, some other sort of way of being able to provide an answer there, because I would just feel that at least I personally would not have the expertise to provide an answer during some sort of actual decision-making process in all cases, maybe in some cases.
Fair point. Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as yesterday, I think I voiced similar thoughts to Commissioner Messner, which is with a full-time commission, I think there's more time for us to be an accessible commission. I think it was hard for a volunteer commission to be accessible because all those folks had other full-time jobs. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us as commissioners to get out into communities and get to understand on the ground kind of what they're experiencing or what the play looks like, so to speak, and to work with local governments and operators and community members. I'm definitely very interested in kind of that liaison or community engagement kind of role, and letting folks know that we are accessible and that we're here to help problem solve. So I'm very interested in that concept, but not being a hearing officer.
Great. Okay, well, consider that flag planted, and I'm sure that some member of our staff is keeping a parking lot memo going, and or you know, I am too. So thank you, Commissioner Messner, for that. With that, I maybe would like to turn it over to Director Murphy to sort of frame the day for us in terms of our next steps on deliberation. I also want to recognize Commissioner Putnam, who chatted that he's got a new computer with a new Zoom camera. Commissioner Putnam, are you able to participate? Are you able to see us? Is that working? Do we need to do anything on that front? Oh, he may have his audio video off. Tell you what I'll do. Director Murphy, if you want to frame the day for us, I'll text Commissioner Putnam and make sure he's available to be with us.
I mean, I can see Commissioner Putnam.
Yeah,
Mr. Chair, I was having some technical difficulty and my speaker's muted, but I'm back.
okay, great. I just wanted to make sure that we had a full Commissioner Putnam with us. Director Murphy.
Never promised that, so.
Great. Well, I've created the parking lot slide, so we're fully prepared to capture things that we need to hold and have a further conversation on outside of either today's discussion or the rulemaking itself. And so I think it might be helpful to just take 2 minutes to recap. I think yesterday we worked through the state and local and state and federal process, and staff has direction on that piece, and we'll continue to kind of check in with some of the stakeholders who had some suggestions on this piece in particular. We worked through a lot of the ALA pieces. I flagged in green a couple of the items that to me are pretty technical but are important considerations that Commissioner Nanjapa flagged at the end of the conversation. My recommendation is to let staff work on those and bring those forward to you, and you can make a decision on them. But that way they've been flagged, they're up for discussion, but we don't need to kind of dive so deeply back into the ALA today. On caps, I think we worked through caps and we have some pretty clear direction. And that brings us to a very significant issue of cumulative impacts. So we have 2 big ones today in my estimation: cumulative impacts and community engagement, disproportionately impacted communities. And then some pieces that we'll need to probably work through fairly quickly around kind of the thematic legal questions, 2A questions, and some of the focused questions and issues. And I know the chair opened it up to say, were there any other things that we should talk about? But if there are other pieces that, as you thought of it over the night, that we can either pull off or add to this list, happy to do it. We'll kind of do it as we go would be my suggestion. I think I'm getting a better feel for this commission, so I will probably start typing staff directions earlier in the conversation to flag so you can understand what I'm hearing and can redirect as appropriate. So with that, I would say, Chair, my suggestion is we jump straight into data gathering on cumulative impacts. I'm going to move the greenhouse gas data question up because I think it aligns closely with data gathering, and let's get her done.
So, Director Murphy, if you or Attorney General Minor could sort of frame the data gathering issue for us, like, what is it that, that as we listen to all of the witnesses, evidence, and testimony, and commissioners can do this too, but I'd like to defer to staff to sort of, you guys helped craft what you came up with the rule on 303A5. What are the different positions that you heard so that we can frame sort of the debate for commissioners?
I am going to turn it over to Mr. Minor because I think he's got his arms around this in greater depth than I do. Also, he can recite, specific rule provision citation from memory, and I have to painstakingly flip through pages. So,
Attorney General Minor.
Thank you, Director Murphy, and I'm glad I have found a job where my weird memory for numbers is actually helpful. So I think that from staff's perspective, one of the key issues around the data gathering is the air quality piece. So that's Rule 303A5B1. It did seem like a lot of stakeholders have ideas there. It seems like probably there's some additional coordination and information from CDPHE that staff could benefit from to ensure that the data being gathered is useful in this context and is really complementary to what CDPHE is doing. So I think I would put sort of both that greenhouse gas data component and some of the broader data gathering around other air pollutants into that category of just sort of those pollutants that might need to be sort of revisited and think more carefully about what those should be in Rule 303A5. I think that really does actually capture a lot of, I think, the data gathering component from what we heard. I do think Commissioner Messner yesterday also brought up another kind of data gathering question about whether recreational values should be included in the list of baseline data that's gathered in Rule 303A5. Then I think there's a second broader question that I heard that goes a little bit beyond data gathering that would get into more of the address component of evaluate and address that seemed to be more centered around, from what I heard from the commissioners yesterday and from many of the parties throughout their presentations, Rule 304C19, which is the cumulative impacts plan that as part of the Form 2A, and whether that might need to be required in more or perhaps all circumstances. And then finally, as a tool to ensure that staff has what it needs to really meaningfully evaluate that cumulative impacts plan. I think we heard from Commissioner Nanjapa and I believe also Commissioner McGowan yesterday that including more sort of baseline information about surrounding oil and gas development on the Form 2D itself. So information about oil and gas locations, oil and gas wells, perhaps acreage of surface disturbance near the proposed oil and gas locations could be useful for doing that case-by-case evaluation. So I think that's probably a high-level summary of the three main data gathering components.
Thank you, Attorney General Minor. I appreciate that insight. I guess at this point, I would open up to commissioners on thoughts, next steps. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you. And this is more of sort of an additional piece that maybe we can all discuss and not necessarily first thing here, but I'm thinking that one thing that occurred to me last night was as this repository builds, it may be that certain areas become evident that they are just kind of no-go areas. And I'm wondering if maybe the development of some sort of map that provides a little bit, and maybe a better way to put it is, you know, like maybe the sort of, you know, the green light areas versus the red light areas, or I don't know, but there's, you know, maybe there's a way that allows for a little bit more certainty, both for the general public and the operators as to what is going to be an appropriate location versus one that just has already demonstrated too many cumulative impacts. So that's still kind of rough in my brain in terms of an idea, but I just wanted to put that out there and maybe have some discussion a little bit later as part of this cumulative impacts discussion.
Commissioner Putnam.
Terrific. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thought this might be a good place just to talk a little bit about what CDPHE is doing and how some of this data gathering might align, since that was certainly questions we heard from the public and comments we heard from the public and parties, as well as questions that were raised by commissioners yesterday. And if it's okay to share my screen, I kind of put together a quick summary slide. Can I just hit the share screen button and do that, or do I need to do something else?
I think we need Ms. Murphy to stop sharing, and then you will then have the opportunity to share, and it looks like she already did that. So I think you have an opportunity to share at this point, Commissioner Putnam. Yep.
Okay, see that?
We see it. Awesome. Thank you.
So let's see, have that be a bigger picture. So just wanted to talk a little bit about how the different information flows between our two departments, or how it could flow. I think given the concept that's laid out in the CIDR provisions of the proposed rules, and how that fits into what APCD and AQCC are doing. Just backing up for a minute in terms of how we think of some of our emissions challenges, certainly for the greenhouse gas compliance and other work that we're doing, we need to take a look at a cumulative view of those emissions. No one site is going to cause the global warming, but when you add all of the methane, CO2, nitrous oxide, other pollutants together, that's what's going to create the problem that the legislature has told us to address. So as a result, the state has been putting together greenhouse gas inventories for the last number of years. We're in the process of trying to improve those inventories, and it was a big focus of Senate Bill 1996 and some of the rulemaking that happened at the AQCC earlier this year. I think it's safe to say we are moving from an approach that uses an EPA tool called the SIT tool, which is very much a bottom-down or top-down approach to calculating those emissions, to trying to use more targeted and state-specific data. We're making a lot of progress in that, and one of the key ingredients for that was a rule that the Air Quality Control Commission passed last December that's requiring annual, very detailed inventories from the oil and gas sector that will start as of next June, and working through with the operators now on exactly how to do that and how to make sure that that reporting comes through. We're going to be updating those rules this upcoming month. That's scheduled for hearing during one of the bi-weeks that COGCC has, and we'll be adding a few additional pollutants, including CO2 and N2O, to that list of pollutants. In parallel, especially for the Front Range area that's an ozone non-attainment, we develop cumulative emissions inventories for ozone precursors, volatile organic compounds, and oxides of nitrogen, and update those on a regular basis, and then include those as part of our state implementation plan that we submit to US EPA. We also have other elements like our regional Haze plan, which is one of the pieces that's being considered this fall. Part of the rulemaking that we have is looking at the engines in this sector. And so we collect a lot of primarily existing and operational data related to that, not as much of the forward-looking data, I think, is what the 300 series is intended to look at. So we critically rely on the greenhouse gas and ozone inventories, as well as some of the other sub-inventories. We use that to feed our models. We use that to feed our attainment strategies. We use that to submit to EPA and others. And so improving the resolution of that data and getting a better look into the future is absolutely critical. So moving to this slide, kind of moving from a bottom-up perspective, source by source, adding up. And one of the things that we're trying to do is better make sure that our top-down, or what we're capturing from aerial overflights or in our monitors from concentration of the air, as opposed to estimates of leaks or tailpipe emissions or other sort of things. We're trying to get those to align better. What I think can work into the future in the way that I think might be useful to think about the CIDR database is to have a forward-looking estimate of kind of what's in the pipeline and proposed for emissions for projects that are subject to permitting at COGCC. Just from a timeline perspective, Form 2As or CAPs are going to be filed before APCD would see any applications for air permits. You get the first look, and therefore getting that information early provides, I think, important information that we can use to get a sense for, what are trends looking like, and how are we doing against the emissions targets that we need to hit for greenhouse gases, ozone, and other pollutants. So next in line in the kind of timeline, the Air Pollution Control Division will receive air pollution emissions notices, or APENs, as well as permit applications that will have more detailed information on a source-by-source, well-by-well basis. And then that all ultimately will lead to, if something is put into operation, our Regulation 7, as of December, requires much more detailed information for both pre-production and production emissions broken out for a variety of areas. And I'm happy to send the kind of current copy of that rule for everybody to take a look at. But it will be a much more detailed set of information that we will use to track our compliance with ozone, greenhouse gas, other sort of rules. And then critically, we'll use that to test and improve the kind of forecasts and inventories to see how did predictions that might have been in CIDR or in permit applications, how are those bearing out in the real world? And how does that need to change the kind of process by which those estimates are approved? How are we doing against our greenhouse gas and ozone targets? How does that affect the regulatory tools that we need, the stringency that we need to move forward? how do we use the tools that we asked the legislature for and the legislature provided in the last session to improve our ability to kind of test using remote sensing and mobile monitoring vans and aerial overflights and other sort of things to make sure that we're accurately capturing all of those areas. As Leah Martin and Sean Hackett mentioned in the presentation to the commission last Tuesday, we do have that rulemaking that's in front of us right now that will both improve the resolution of these emissions inventories, but also require that all new drilling sites will have monitoring associated with them through pre-production into the early part of production, where we would expect to see the highest emissions related to any source. As Ms. Martland and Mr. Hackett had pointed out, we view that really as the beginning of a much greater deployment of emissions monitoring technology and requirements in the field as ultimately necessary to provide the management of these pollutants that we need moving into the future, and allow us to both understand that our inventories are working correctly, inform leak detection and control, failing equipment, other sort of things, so that we can actually reduce emissions, minimize emissions as required by Senate Bill 181. So kind of backing up, what does that all mean for CIDR? I think given that overall picture, it would make the most sense to align the CIDR requirements with the pollutants and categories that we're capturing in our existing Regulation 7. And the pollutants that are either included currently or proposed in front of the Air Commission, and would expect that those are likely going to pass this next month, are carbon monoxide, ethane, methane, VOCs, oxides of nitrogen, CO2, and N2O, with CO2, N2O, and methane being the most important of the greenhouse gases on that list. So that you would have that information, we would have that information, and ultimately the public would have that information to understand not just kind of a backward-looking what emissions were last year, but forward-looking what's kind of in the pipeline of projects that are either proposed or that have been approved. And we can use that to gauge our trajectory for emissions reductions that we'll need to comply with the state's greenhouse gas rules, federal ozone standards, other sort of pieces. And so I think that's kind of the vision I've talked a little bit with COGCC staff about, and based on our discussions internally with CDPHE in terms of how we align these pieces moving forward. Separate conversation, which I would love to come back to, how do you use that information? How do we use that information in a kind of substance of addressing cumulative impacts, but at least in assessing impacts, this would be the first start. I'll also note two other things and then relinquish the mic. One, the targets that we'll create for greenhouse gases and other pieces are ones that would certainly, they're part of a public process, and I would think that COGCC, would have and would be able to use those pieces as part of their assessment and their work. And then also, we are exploring with the AQCC creating a dashboard that would present kind of critical information on a monthly or quarterly basis on kind of critical indicators of our trajectory of greenhouse gas reduction compliance. And some of those pieces could include production from either oil or gas, some of the emissions associated with that, but also kind of what's in the pipeline that may be coming through CIDR, may be coming through our permitting, to provide that kind of sense for not just backwards looking, but forwards looking, how are we doing against the targets that we need to meet. So with that, I'll happy to address questions, but that's kind of the vision and suggestion I had, and I will also send to Ms. Larson the kind of current proposal for our Regulation 7 that contains the gory details of our inventory requirements.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. To my fellow commissioners, do folks have questions of Commissioner Putnam? That was a lot of information. Commissioner McGowan.
Commissioner Putnam, just for folks on the phone who are not familiar with CDPHE's air quality processes, can you remind everybody what an APEN is?
It's a great question. So an APEN is an air pollution emissions notice. It's what's required for somebody who wants to create a new source of air pollution or a substantially modified pollution. It is required under state statute. And one of the areas that we've been taking a look at modernizing along with all of our other permit requirements for oil and gas and other sources. So it's a kind of a 5-year look ahead. Often has not had the same level of resolution just because it's required to be put in place before people would drill a well and would have an idea both of the very specific chemical content and the actual flows that are expected from a well. We're looking to try to improve a lot of that resolution and predictive power for the submissions that we get.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Putnam, could you remind me what is going to be collected, what pollutants are going to be monitored at the on-site monitoring that's being proposed by the commission? It doesn't collect all the pollutants that are listed for suggested baseline, correct, in your slide?
That's correct. The current proposal is really going to be focused on leaks as one of the areas that I think is harder to predict, and therefore that monitoring is most helpful. The current proposal is that entities would file a monitoring plan that we would propose, and that it would at least capture volatile organic compounds as being more readily measured in a kind of shorter time frame than some of the, for example, benzene or specific pollutants associated with that. That requires generally more complicated measurement equipments like our mobile monitoring lab that we use. But they will need to submit that plan to the division, which would then approve that plan. But it would be heavily focused on those hydrocarbons.
Thank you.
Other commissioners with questions of our Commissioner Putnam? Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Commissioner Putnam. That really helped me get my head around some things, and so thank you for that presentation. That's kind of the way that I thought it was going to happen, but that visual helped me actually concrete it in my scattered brain, so thank you for that. I did have one question though. So we're collecting a certain amount of information in the cumulative impacts analysis or the CIDR information. I understand how that then is being utilized by CDPHE. How will it be utilized in consultation with CDPHE on individual OGDP applications as far as potential conditions of approval?
Thank you, Commissioner Messner. It's a great question, and I think one of the things that we've been focusing on at a staff level, just to try to understand our role in the Commission's process, and knowing that one of the requirements of Senate Bill 181 is that COGCC will create the rules and create the process for considering and addressing cumulative impacts in consultation with CDPHE, and we're trying to figure out how to do that in the most productive way. So I think to get to your point, where we currently see that happening would be in a couple of ways. First, to continue to inform the Commission and update the Commission on how we're doing on our ozone, greenhouse gas, and other compliance as a kind of big picture perspective on kind of how we're doing as a state. And that's a big part of the reason why we're going through the greenhouse gas roadmap process that we also talked about last week. We're updating the state implementation plan for ozone. Clearly, we need reductions across the board, but including the oil and gas sector to hit our requirements and objectives for greenhouse gas and ozone. So, want to continue to provide you that context when you're looking both at the big picture and individual pieces. And then second, I think, as we've already done in those areas that we already consult on, to really provide suggestions on the best management practices and, kind of best in class performance for reducing emissions in those areas. And, we've talked about a lot of those in the past: electrifying drilling, electrifying other operations, using instrument air or electric instrumentation, making sure that you've got takeaway capacity so that you don't have to flare more than necessary. Go to tankless operations so that you don't have the truck trips, you don't have as many places to have leaks and points of emissions. There's a kind of evolving area. I think you saw in one of the slides related to Crestone yesterday, that's an example, or Noble in Mustang, are different examples of things that are either at or very close to the kind of state of the art for minimizing emissions in that sector, and to provide that feedback to you to, consider in that process, when we're consulted under the new protocols.
Thank you.
So, and I don't want to sound too sophomoric on this, but, my thought here is, at least conceptually, is my direction to staff is, will you go touch base with CDPHE and maybe amend the rule consistent with the asks that we heard, and then bring something back to us? It seems to me that there are certain elements of additions to cider that we heard sort of loud and clear, but again, I'm not a scientist, and so I don't know this specific precise answers, and I think that some further in collegiance with CDPHE, which is what the statute told us to do, makes some sense here. But again, I don't want to sort of dilute the commission's discussion on this topic, and I'm happy to have you more educated scientists weigh in. Commissioner McGowan.
Well, I'm not the educated scientist, but I think I have some things I'd like for us to discuss so that when staff goes back, they
Karen,
have
we
some
lost you. I
direct-
think you're on mute.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying I'm not the scientist in the room, but I think there's some concepts that some of us threw out that might work, might not work, that we warrant discussion before we send staff off. And as I've been kind of thinking about cumulative impacts, there's a couple things that are really kind of niggling at me, and I don't know if that's an appropriate word, I apologize. One is cumulative impact. I think we heard from people who testified they have concerns that we're thinking about the landscape cumulative impact, which is kind of the discussion we're having right now when we're doing the cider collection and the modeling, and how is it helping us meet these overarching overall goals. And then I think there is the concept of the micro cumulative impact. By adding this one site, what is the impact to a smaller footprint? And I don't have an answer to that, but I don't think that what we just talked about now addresses the concern that came up, I think, in some of the discussions that we had. So I also am trying to figure out how to marry the address and evaluate. And so for me, addressing is collecting data, asking for changes in behavior or the way that we do business. And I don't think that we've really talked about how we connect a cumulative impact assessment, to Commissioner Messner's point, to an OGDP. I would be interested. So I get that we don't have exact baseline data right now, but I think the purpose of Senate Bill 181 is to minimize and reduce emissions. And so even though we don't have exact baseline data, do we do our best effort or use the data that we have to start working on reducing emissions? And would we, based on a cumulative impact assessment, say to an operator, our goal to start off with, and we know that it's going to get tailored and it's going to get refined based on constant information that's being collected through CITER or through monitoring through CDPHE, our goal to start off with is an X% reduction. And don't turn in a cumulative impact analysis or an OGGP that doesn't have or show a certain reduction in your emissions activity. And this is just talking about air, and there's so many other cumulative impacts for us to talk about. And I think we need to make that connection to addressing and evaluating and action. And there's got to be some sort of something that ties all the pieces together that starts showing reduction in emissions. And then I think we've not really talked about the evaluation piece at all. So as we start collecting this data, I think there needs to be a meaningful way for us to share with operators, local governments, community, whether or not these strategies that we're putting in place are actually working towards a reduction goal that we have. So for me, I think there's still so many pieces that we need to put together, and I don't have the answer for them, but I'm uncomfortable leaving them unaddressed.
Mr. Chair, if I,
Commissioner Minor, or I'm sorry, Attorney General Minor, why don't you weigh in and then we'll get to Commissioner Messner. And Commissioner Messner's saying that he thinks that makes sense.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner McGowan, I think I can provide perhaps some concepts that staff has built into the rules already, as well as others that could be built into the rules, and I may draw on the expertise of the actual experts here, Mr. Duranlo and Ms. Trask, who are also available to weigh in. You know, in terms of your last point about how to meaningfully share the evaluation and sort of coming to some formal evaluation based on the data in the CITER database, for better or for worse, staff did propose some of that component really to be in Rule 904, which is in the 900 series. Staff's intent was to sort of put those bigger picture evaluations specifically of the emissions piece of cumulative impacts there. So without suggesting that, of course, you have to defer that discussion till later, that is a discussion that staff did attempt to tee up with Rule 904, though again, as proposed, Rule 904 does only address sort of those evaluations of cumulative impacts from the emissions side. It doesn't have, as currently proposed, evaluations of cumulative impacts to something like wildlife habitat fragmentation, for example. And then, you know, I think that perhaps Mr. Duranlo or Ms. Trask could talk about how the cumulative impacts plan could be a tool that could be used to work with operators to identify the sort of other piece that you were talking about on the address, which is looking at emissions reductions or other ways to mitigate adverse incremental impacts that are identified through the cumulative impacts evaluation. Though obviously there's not a great deal of detail in the rule text as proposed, so it may be useful for Mr. Duranlo and Ms. Trask to hear more about what sorts of details the Commission is interested in hearing. And then last but certainly not least, in terms of sort of the landscape impact and understanding cumulative impacts in the context of what's already there, I think that is sort of what I was trying to mention briefly at the beginning earlier when we were discussing staff's potential ideas around incorporating some sort of baseline data about other surrounding oil and gas development onto the Form 2B. And I know that is something Ms. Trask has already been working on and I believe sort of briefly described for you the other day, but I think each of those points, they could provide probably some more detailed feedback on what staff could do and then could hear more from you about what the Commission is hoping to see in that regard.
Commissioner McGowan, do you have follow-up?
Only that it's frustrating to me that everything is connected to the 900 series.
Yeah, and that's part and parcel of this puzzle that we're putting together, in that we're trying to identify pieces, here when we're going to be focused on the northeast edge of the puzzle with the 900 series later. And I get it. That's hard. And we're going to, get to the end of this, and then we're going to start up on, 8, 9, and 12. So I agree with your
It's
point.
good for discussion, just so folks know that we're tackling this piece first and that it is connected to another piece that we're gonna get to. I think it's good for folks, even just in our discussions here, to understand that it is, we have it, it's in the parking lot, and we're gonna get to it and connect all these dots. Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, not a problem. And I would also sort of float out to the commission as a whole that this is our rulemaking, and we can adjust and be nimble however we think is best. And if it's better to, and I hate to say table, but take this discussion and have it when we're talking 900, we can do that. I mean, it is our rulemaking. So I just sort of float that out as an informational idea. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, AAG Minor, for that clarification. And I do think some of this conversation does happen in the 900, but I still, one of the reasons that I asked the question about the consultation and the, the associated conditions of approval that may be, that may come from that consultation with CDPHE is because I do think a lot of the burden of this analysis and these suggestions needs to come from that consultation with CDPHE, and CDPHE ultimately, as the experts in some of these entities or some of these concepts, need to provide clear direction in that consultation as to what conditions need to be put on different applications in order to meet and mitigate some of these cumulative impacts. And so I don't think it all has to be housed in the COGCC. That's why we have other agencies. And, I also think while we're talking right now about air quality, we're talking about some of the elements that would be in a CDPHE consultation. I also think it's really important that same level of information is provided by CPW, and that they're actually looking at, cumulative impacts and are looking careful at this section in the cumulative impact piece here, because as I look at the terrestrial and aquatic wildlife resources piece, as far as the information that's being developed in the CITER, I'm not sure that ties directly into some bigger cumulative impact analysis that CPW is doing or not. Maybe it is, but I guess I would be curious to hear from maybe Commissioner Boag, how this cumulative impact information may tie into some bigger cumulative impact analysis that CPW may be doing. And if that's not information that you have readily available, maybe we could get that information at some point here today. But thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's certainly something I can dig into with our folks at CPW and get more information. But my thoughts would be that, yeah, I mean, this is information that's going to play into, the habitat assessments that they perform, the assessments that they perform for sort of species of greatest conservation need. They're doing those species assessments every year, for many species of greatest conservation concern and others. So yeah, this is information that's going to be really relevant to their ongoing work. So I think we should advance conversations about how CPW can contribute to these cumulative impact analyses, because they do have the expertise to inform you guys about sort of what it really means for wildlife populations.
Thank you, Commissioner Boag.
And
go ahead.
Sorry, Chair, if I could, just so everyone's on the same page, my last name is pronounced Boag, but I don't hold it against any of you for saying Boag, because it's very common, so thanks.
Thank you. We got that. I think we can make an adjustment on the fly. Appreciate that. Other commissioners, Commissioner Nanjapa.
Yeah, thank you for that. Those comments, Commissioner Messner. I think I have been trying to figure out some of these things too. And, in the discussions that have happened with respect to what we're asking and, whether it's necessary and reasonable, kind of thinking about that throughout all the things that we're looking at here. I think those are really important points. What are the things that are being collected, being housed that we can just refer to and work with, through CDPHE or CPW. And, to your point on the wildlife issues, that was one thing I was thinking of and have been intending to bring it up, especially later on. But, this has come up in some of the comments here, the state wildlife action plans, that's an effort that they undertake. That's a very comprehensive evaluation of threats to the various species and contributes to the changes in which species are considered greatest conservation need each year. And then of course there's existing priority species that are continued to be evaluated. And so yeah, I think I just, more just sort of appreciate those thoughts and considerations and would want to have a better sense of what are all those existing data repositories that are out there and how frequently are they updated. And I'm not sure how, how best to attack that, but, just again, in general, I'm in favor of not reinventing the wheel and, trying to make things efficient as possible.
Other commissioners that desire to weigh in here? Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think just following up, especially on Commissioner Messner's point, one other place that we've talked to staff is that, as we mentioned in last week's commission meeting, we will be kicking off a stakeholder process. I think Mr. Martin referred to it either yesterday or the day before in party presentations, to look, at a stakeholder process that will try to address how to get some of the deep reductions in overall emissions that we're going to need to meet greenhouse gas and ozone goals. Our proposal was roughly a third by 2025 and 50% by 2030, give or take. And I think one of the places, have talked to CFGCC staff is make sure that your staff is part of that process. Maybe even one of you be part of that process, so that we can use that to continue to align both the programs, but also the regulations and make sure that they're as seamless as possible. I think one of the challenges we'll have is, we do consult on a regular basis. We'll continue to consult, certainly provide kind of big picture guidance, and then the hard ones, we don't have staff from the legislature to work on every permit that you're going to see. So we have to figure out some way of just practically making it work as well, just because we've got our own permitting programs. We're staffed by the legislature to do that and have some capacity to work on consultation, but not, to a point that, we can cover every permit that application that you're going to get. So trying to figure out how to operationalize that is one of the areas that we know that we need to, continue to work with Director Murphy and staff on.
Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Commissioner Messner.
I'm going to a little bit of a different topic here. Is that appropriate, or are we still at kind of a higher level here in cumulative impacts? I don't want to totally shift topics. I'm still talking cumulative impacts, but I would be interested in talking about the inclusion of kind of looking at impacts to recreation and scenic values, and having that as part of the analysis as well, particularly on the western, well, I won't even say particularly on the western slope. Generally speaking, I mean, outdoor recreation is a significant part of the economy of the state of Colorado, and I think it's an important element to be considering as we look at cumulative impacts, is what are these impacts to recreation, infrastructure, and scenic values. And so I guess I'm curious about thoughts on that as we look at cumulative impacts, because we certainly have, I think, good concepts around impacts to wildlife and terrestrial and riparian habitats and water and soil and ecosystems, but it seems like recreation and scenic values may be missing.
Well, and Commissioner Messner, so you successfully pivoted the discussion into that arena, which is great. I think I would sort of take a step back and ask the commission about ideas around whether we should have cumulative impacts analysis applicable to each and every Form 2A, instead of sort of what it's now at this point is sort of optional or at the director's request. I think that, I'm sort of kind of in favor of that. I think it allows staff to work with the operator on a sort of a case-by-case basis to address cumulative impacts to specific resources. And, recreation, as you point out, could be one of those, but it also doesn't have to specify certain thresholds applicable to every sort of resource in every case. So I would take your pivot and double down on it and ask commissioners to think about it from that perspective. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Sure. Yeah, I'd be curious, when we think about applying a CI analysis to every 2A that comes across, how much is going to change in those cumulative impacts from one permit to the next I'm just curious what the incremental addition of data will be for those evaluations from, July 1st to July 2nd to July 3rd as we're getting those permits through. I don't really know that I'm quite seeing the vision of what that looks like. So maybe Chair Robbins or Commissioner Messner can maybe fill that in for me a little bit. Maybe Director Murphy as well. But I'm failing to quite understand the mechanisms for applying that CI evaluation on a incremental 2A by 2A basis.
Director Murphy?
Sure. So I think part of the value of gathering the data is actually quantifying it or being able to describe it and acknowledging it. And looking at the differential impact of an electrified facility versus a non-electrified facility and weigh those, right? And start to better understand what the cumulative impact means. And for some, I think you're right, there will be a zero or a negligible or a net no cumulative impact in some cases, right? Like if wells are being plugged out, if other surface is being reclaimed, like if you're reclaiming 5 or 6 different pads in the drilling and spacing unit and developing less acreage overall, you're having a total decrease in net disturbance, right? And so I think that all of the data comes in different forms and fashions and can better inform all of the questions that we have. I mean, in my experience over the last couple of years, most folks come to our rulemakings with a conclusion about industry is making air quality better because of X, industry is making air quality worse because of Y. And this to me starts to actually build the data to support one or both or neither of those conclusions. And to date, it's not something that we have captured very well. And also it is true that like as you look at these kind of increasing community or increasing density of development and understanding what that means at the community level, at the more macro level, is really difficult. And I guess all of this to say, and then I would actually turn it to or ask if Joel or Greg want to contribute as well, is that the fundamental the exercise has value in terms of looking at what those numbers are to me or the impacts are. And I totally lost my train of thought. That was really, really brilliant. But maybe it'll come back to me while Joel is talking. So forgive me, sorry.
Attorney General Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think I will just tee up sort of a broader discussion for Mr. Duranlo to have by sort of going back to some of my initial presentation on Tuesday about staff's intended purpose for the Form 2B. And as Director Murphy said, the purpose of the Form 2B is a data gathering tool. It's to start building that repository of data. So then to answer your question, Commissioner Gonzalez, of how will staff be able to use that data in the Form 2A process and actually making decisions on the permit. What staff has proposed and could expand with your direction is the cumulative impacts plan in 304C19. And I think that really goes to how that will be used is important to understand how staff uses all the plans that are associated with the Form 2A. These are not just things that sit on the shelf for someone to look at. They are an opportunity for iterative back and forth discussion with an operator throughout the course of evaluating a Form 2A, where staff can work with the operator to really figure out some tough questions that might come up later in advance as part of the permitting process. So, and Mr. Dronlo, I might ask you to speak a little more into that, but just to think about Commissioner Messner's example, were recreational values to be added to, say, perhaps the public welfare section of the Form 2B, it might create an opportunity for staff to then have in the database, like, gosh, we have a really scenic vista here. There's some ridge or mountain peak that a lot of people go to and hike. And we've realized we've actually had recently 5 or 6 different locations that are all visible from that area that could have an impact on recreation. So that means that in the Form 2A cumulative impacts plan, that could create an opportunity for staff to work with the operator, having gathered the data about that cumulative impact, to think about tools that could be used to address that impact, perhaps better visual impact mitigation, trying to blend into the landscape in a better or different way that staff can use the plan to essentially work with the operator on. So Mr. Geronimo, do you want to add more about that and just perhaps how you and your team really do use the plans on a case-by-case basis?
Mr. Geronimo.
Sure, thank you. Greg Duranlo, Environmental Manager. I would say that, we have had the opportunity to use various plans, take the waste management plan, which is currently required. Again, it doesn't mean that there's no waste generated from a site, but it gives us the opportunity to review the operator's plans for both, removing the waste from the site, managing it on site, hauling it away. We can ask about the haul routes associated with that waste management plan and whether those haul routes will be impactful. That has been a successful tool. And so I think carrying that forward, to the same concept to the cumulative impacts plan review, I think it does give us that opportunity to have that iterative discussion. It doesn't necessarily mean that the operator is coming to us with a pristine site that won't have any impacts one way or another on cumulative impacts, but it gives us an opportunity to find out what they're really doing to minimize their incremental contributions to cumulative impacts, and whether there's better ways to achieve those impacts, whether there's better best management practices that they can put in place, whether offsetting, such as plugging and abandoning nearby wells would offset some of their impacts, or perhaps create a beneficial impact as well. So I think that's where we're really looking at this. And to kind of piggyback on Joel's example, I can recall some sites that were proposed in the Pawnee Buttes area some time ago, where we really did work with the operator up in that area to pull their sites down into some sort of lower lands so that they weren't so visible from a scenic view area. And so, we've got some experience doing that, and we would carry that forward.
Thank you, Mr. Dronlo. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you very much for clearing that up. That's the way I kind of read the analysis going, is a contribution to a data set, which I think is extremely important, right? We need the information. The more information, the better. Helps educate better decisions. And then coupling that with a CI plan, obviously allows the operator to say, hey, here's what I'm doing, here's what's good, here's what's bad, here's how we're mitigating, and gives your team, Mr. Geronimo, the the best position to make those evaluations, given the information that you guys already know, along with the information you're seeing from other operators, I think is very helpful. So that all makes sense to me, just kind of the way that would work. And so in that framework, I'm comfortable with that process. So I appreciate the explanation.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I think just continuing along these lines, I think as Commissioner Gonzalez was just asking, about, how does it compare from sort of one permit to the next, and the way these incremental pieces add together, and the explanations are really helpful in terms of how you're already sort of doing that in practice. So it kind of brings me back to the thing I flagged towards the beginning here of our discussion this morning of, I called them no-go areas. Now, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about maybe it leads to some sort of map of high impact areas where there must be mitigation done, or there, if your proposed location falls within those areas, there's certain types of things have to be done to reduce the overall impact. I'm just kind of thinking about, again, also building on things that everybody has said, and in particular, Commissioner McGowan had raised about emissions and, all the different things that could potentially be done there, and the view shed examples, if we're starting to see by accumulating these different pieces that you have certain areas that are just higher impact already, and even as, the one proposed location kind of contributes to how that next one is going to be evaluated, maybe that's a way that we could also, again, further incentivize mitigation measures. And to me, this also ties back into the comprehensive area plans that we talked about yesterday too.
Thank you. Director Murphy?
I want to suggest a way to maybe kind of start to get some direction to staff, which I think is, one, starting to focus on, are we collecting the right, has staff proposed to collect the right data? And I've heard, at least from Commissioner Messner, that we need to look at additional data around recreational values, recreation and scenic values, and from Commissioner Putnam that we need to perhaps realign or maybe wholesale throw out and then coordinate with CDPHE on a different data set. And so if we can start with, are we collecting the right data? And staff can implement that, and then look at this kind of second step of what are or should we be doing with it, maybe a stepwise way to advance the conversation. And then kind of, and if we can hold the kind of like, how are we going to evaluate it for a little bit? Let's get the data right. Let's answer some of these kind of like more operational questions about how the data is coming in. And that may better frame out and will give us all a little bit more time to think through the evaluation piece. And I'm probably overstepping my bounds right now, but I know that I need a little more direction on what staff should be doing in the coming days.
I appreciate your nudging us here, Director Murphy, and nudge well taken. I also would like to see the additional data include the other existing nearby oil and gas development, such as, locations, wells, acreage of surface disturbance, things along those lines, so that we can get some perspective of what's already on the ground and happening with regard to oil and gas development in the area. I think we heard a lot of testimony around that. And, if you add another location to a location that already has significant development, that's different than having one location that is not near any other location. So I would add that component to the John Putnam component and to the John Messner component. Other commissioners that would like to take this nudge and move with it?
Yes.
Commissioner Messner.
I was just agreeing that I think you nailed it there. I would just add one other thing, is that And this probably has already happened, so I apologize if it already has. But I just want to make sure, just like, Commissioner Putnam is indicating that there needs to be, coordination with CDPHE so that both COGCC and CDPHE, are collecting apples and apples rather than apples and oranges. I'd like to see that same thing happen with CPW to make sure that whatever cumulative impact plans or migratory corridor plans or whatever plan CDPHE or CPW is utilizing, that we're also collecting apples to utilize in apple farm.
Other commissioners that desire to weigh in on this? Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think just picking up on your point about nearby oil and gas facilities, starting next summer when we're going to have the detailed reporting information, it would be good to link to that emissions information so that you'll not only know, is there a well 1,000 feet away from the proposed site, but what's it emitting, so that you get a better idea of just how active it is and what some of the cumulative effects might be.
Director Murphy, if you could take that and run with it as well. I think it's sort of a proactive, that the rule would change once that new information is being generated at a QCC. Commissioner Nanjapa, did you have something to add? Okay. Sorry, I saw you leaning.
This time I was leaning just to read the small print.
Okay, well, Director Murphy, nudge well taken. I think you've got some direction on the front of data gathering. If I could, I would sort of suggest we think about some of the other pieces on our cumulative impacts spreadsheet here. Should COGCC perform it or operators was a question, or I think others said third parties, and should we have filing fees to cover that? My initial suggestion, or sort of my initial thoughts on this, is that I'm comfortable with operators putting this together with the COGCC being the reviewing entity to determine whether it is sufficient and full and complete. I think that COGCC will also, in looking at the plan, find things that it wants to make sure are on certain plans and perhaps are not on other plans. So I'll sort of kick off the discussion around this topic with those ideas and look to my fellow commissioners for observations. Commissioner McGowan?
I think that's a good, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that's a good starting point. I think the concern from some of the folks testifying was, relying on someone who's being regulated to turn in their own self-assessment, so to speak. And so I think as long as there's some sort of a check and balance and a verification of the information and the assessment and the data that's being turned in, I think that's an okay place for us to start.
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I want to just kind of reiterate what Commissioner McGowan said. We heard it loud and clear. There's a concern about industry and operators kind of self-reporting, bringing that information on in their own. I think that perhaps Director Murphy may be able to chime in on I guess the trustworthiness of the information that's provided to date in her experience, as well as you, Chair Robbins, in your former role as director. It'd be my suggestion that I'd like to give operators a chance to bring that information forward, and for us, as we start receiving this under this new rule, to really evaluate the sufficiency of it and adapt from there.
Director Murphy.
Thank you. I would like to offer that one of the benefits that we have, because we have diverse operators, is the ability to look across different plans, analyses, and proposals. And I think that helps provide some of the, I guess, ground truthing about what's out there. And this is kind of surprise question for Commissioner Putnam, but it seems to me that maybe if we are at least in the space where we have shared regulatory authority, if we're collecting forward-looking data and air quality is correct, collecting the actual data, if we can start to compare those, does that help, at least in this space, or in that like regulatory space, ground truth data or information submitted?
Thank you. Thank you, Director Murphy, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. The answer is yes, and I think going back to the slide that I presented, which by the way I've shared with Ms. Larson so she can include as part of the file and share with the public and other commissioners. In some ways I should make that a circle rather than a line. We should use the data that we're getting about actual emissions and some of our ground testing of that through some of the different monitoring and other sort of tools that we're either providing ourselves or will be requiring to go back and check against what you are getting in terms of, you know, proposals and estimates at the front end to make sure that we understand what's happening, that those are accurate and make them better over time. And so I would say as part of the program here that we don't just look at you know, a purely linear approach and something comes in the door, it's approved or rejected or modified, and then that's that. You know, for some proportion of them, you go back and double check to make sure, you know, was this a reasonable prediction of what happened on the ground? And if not, either with regard to the process or maybe that particular application, you know, there needs to be, you know, some correction moving forward to iteratively make this, you know, a better approach. You know, emissions estimation in this area has been historically very difficult. The federal government has not been investing in it over the last decade or so. And so, you know, the state is trying to pick up our game to really do that. And, you know, that should be, you know, a joint effort between us and should be transparent with all the stakeholders.
Great, thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Any other weigh-ins on this topic from commissioners at this point? Okay, Director Murphy, do you feel you've received some direction on this point?
Like on the point of cumulative impacts broadly?
No, on the point of verify, and so basically have operators perform it, but we're doing the verification.
Right, and we'll explore with staff kind of how to verify. I think that's where staff's kind of deep expertise, both in environmental consulting in the oil and gas space and familiarity with a number of different industries helps build out the knowledge base from which we can also critically evaluate it. And I mean, I think every submittal that comes into our agency is certified by an operator. And I mean, I think most humans, including oil and gas and environmental and everybody else, are good human beings. And when they're certifying things, they do believe it to be true, to kind of address one of Commissioner Gonzalez's underlying questions that I never quite got to. But we will take a look at the kind of how to verify. So I do feel like I have good direction on that. On the filing fees thing, I would note, and of course, AAG Davenport should correct me, but filing fees weren't really noticed. I understand that it is something that our commission is directed by 181 to take up. I think it is something we'll take up, just not today. And, you know, getting these rules and processes in place will help us understand what that filing fee number and conversation should look like. And so I think that there's some benefit in terms of setting today what the process is, giving us a little bit of time to work with it, and then trying to evaluate what the fee can look like. And so I would just suggest in this SVP that we noted that filing fees were requested, and it's something that we'll take up in the future.
Well, and I agree. And I also think the sort of the filing fees issue was, if we were going to have a third party do the assessment, we needed to generate money to be able to pay the third party. And since I have full confidence that staff can do the assessment, I think that's where we're landing. I think we can take the filing fee off the table, and I agree it's not noticed anyway. And it also is a subsequent rulemaking that we're going to get to after we get through what's on our current table. So appreciate that point, Director Murphy. Segueing to something that I had raised earlier, and I don't, oh, go ahead, Commissioner Nanjapa.
I'm sorry, just on the note of filing fees, I think there was one suggestion that the filing fees would help to cover even staff time to conduct that additional cumulative impacts analysis. So I just wanted to make sure that we weren't, that we were thinking of it in terms of that as well, even regardless of if we're actually going to discuss fee amounts at this point.
Point well taken, Commissioner Nanjapa, and I think that that's kind of where Director Murphy was going, is that let's get this in place, let's get this started. That will help further inform us when we get to the filing fees discussion next year at some point in time, because we'll have had a history of 6, 8, 7 months, whatever it is, that of looking at these sorts of things. And I think that actually just makes sense, and I think it makes sense that we take up filing fees after we've done this new regulatory protocol for a while, because we'll certainly have a better understanding of the work of staff in reviewing the new OGDP process. So with that, in an effort to continue to move us forward, do commissioners want to weigh in on the concept that some have asked for, which was to have cumulative impact analysis for each OGDP, as opposed to what's currently in the rule is that it's discretionary to director? And AG Minor, did I get what's currently in the rule correct?
That's correct. Yeah, Rule 304 C19 as proposed allows the director discretion to request that an operator submit a cumulative impacts plan as part of the Form 2A submission, which is of course part of the broader OGDP package, but it does not require it in every case.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
I have a question for staff in kind of drafting this rule. What were you thinking about in terms of what those triggers would look like? Obviously there was something envisioned for when a director may ask for a plan as opposed to requiring it in all instances. So I'd like some background on that.
Certainly, I might put Mr. Dronlow or Ms. Trask on the spot if they're open to it, to sort of describe staff's intent in more detail. But as a general matter, I think staff recognized as they were putting together all of the list of the data that would come in on the Form 2B, that they will see patterns among operators where, say, gosh, this is an outlier in terms of this operator's sort of overall topsoil disturbance, and why is that happening? And maybe we can work with the operator to avoid sort of cumulative degradation of topsoil within an area, for example. So I will turn it over to the actual experts who know a lot more about that than I do.
Mr. Drellin.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I mean, I think it's also important to point out that, this is a new step for COGCC to be taking. And so kind of, I don't want to say putting our toe in the water rather than jumping right in. I think there's no avoiding jumping right in, but also, letting there be some flexibility to the process as we enter into this realm, to see how that determination is made, when it's most appropriate. Again, we were steering away from the cumulative impacts and evaluation being a individual Form 2A citing tool, and really being more of a data gathering tool. So with that in mind, it didn't make sense to require the plan on every single Form 2A until we kind of know more what the baseline looks like and what we're comparing against. And so leaving it a bit flexible, I think, just felt a little bit more of a comfortable starting point.
Commissioner's thoughts on this? Commissioner Messner, looks like you were maybe going to say something.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I mean, I understand the sticking the toe in the water deal, but at the same time, I do think that the analysis that's being done, and just so that I understand and make sure that I'm correct here, the cider information is collected on every single application. So that already is collected on every single application. So all we're talking about is how to utilize that information in whether or not to require a cumulative impacts plan, which is basically, in my mind, saying we've collected the information, we understand the cumulative impacts, but we're not requiring a plan on how to address some of those. And I understand that some of those things are going to be addressed in a lot of other plans, but it does seem like it makes sense to utilize a cumulative impacts plan in almost every instance that I can think of. And so I'm leaning towards, wanting to see that included in every 2A. But maybe I'm not, I could be talked out of it if there are instances or there's really not, it's not a good idea to do it on everyone. But I mean, really, I think this is the action item in the 2A for addressing some of the potential impacts that were highlighted in the cider evaluation.
And if I may, Chair Robbins?
Yes, Commissioner, or Environmental Manager Duranlo.
Yeah, I don't think you want to promote me. So I would say, that was also one place that we were looking at the difference between an oil and gas development plan and a Form 2A and the CAP. And, where the CAP, we would really be looking at that, comprehensive planning and landscape level view of how an operator can really make an impact and a dent on their contributions to cumulative impacts. Whereas, when you're looking at adding a single location in an already, heavily developed area, weighing those impacts and incremental impacts to cumulative impacts, I think, and again, making a permitting decision based on that is a little bit more challenging. And so I think for example, looking at wildlife, our conversations with our partners at CPW say that, in a 1 square mile area, the first pad, you can't talk about cumulative impacts. The second through the fifth in a 1 square mile area, you can talk about cumulative impacts. Once you get beyond that, you've sort of reached the point where the impacts are complete. So if an operator comes in and proposes an additional pad in a 1 square mile area that the affected resource is wildlife, it may not be necessary to continue to address cumulative impacts because they've been accumulated to the point that the wildlife has gone elsewhere. For people, for human receptors, it's different, right? So you keep adding those pads and you keep aggregating those impacts to the human receptor. So I think that's where that flexibility for the director to say, sometimes it's appropriate to get that cumulative impacts plan, and sometimes it may not be appropriate to get that cumulative impacts plan, was another thought, of how we were approaching that.
Thank you, Mr. Duranlo. I guess I'm still sort of in favor of the cumulative impacts for each OGDP, but with the knowledge that, it can be different dependent upon what the OGDP is. Some of them can be more robust and some of them can be, less robust. Director Murphy, I see that you've unmuted. Would you like to weigh in?
I would a little bit in that I think we should take, I guess what I want to start with is the context. This, as Greg said, is our first foray into cumulative impacts, and we've had, I think, this rule may be the one where we've seen the most evolution over the course of the last 9 months. And I think giving staff a bit of time to work on it in this space of how does the cumulative impacts plan interrelate with cider? And that's what one of my notes about clarifying in the SPP, this interrelationship between kind of these 4 different components, the plan, cider, the 2A, and then the oil and gas development plan. Give us a chance, I think, to refine that interrelationship and look at this piece of a plan as appropriate. The expectation that there's a plan in place. And again, if staff doesn't hit the right mark, that's great. We'll take another cut at it with your direction. But I think we can make progress in this space, and I'd like the opportunity to bring it forward to you, and also the opportunity to better articulate the interrelationship between these pieces.
Seeing several heads nodding. Other commissioners desire to weigh in. I think that's a good space for us to be, and then we can look at what you've developed. Okay, sensing we've beaten this horse, are there other areas around cumulative impacts that deserve attention? And I'm sort of looking at Director Murphy or AAG Minor. Did we miss anything?
I think this gives us really good concrete direction to implement a lot of the pieces that are necessary to better frame the bigger picture question that I think is still being explored by commissioners around evaluate. I mean, sorry, address. I mean, no, yeah, address.
And I think part of that's going to be pertinent to the 900 series discussion, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So we'll work on this, and recognizing it, just like all of the work staff has done in this arena and others, is very iterative. Great. With that, unless there's other commissioners that have things to weigh in, I'm going to suggest now that we've gotten through that, a 10-minute break before we jump into the remainder of our morning schedule. And it is 10:34. Let's get back together at 10:45. Thanks, everybody. Break, and applaud Commission and for getting through the good topic of cumulative impacts. I believe now that we should focus in on, thank you, Director Murphy, community engagement and the DI communities questions, issues. You know, I know that staff had put together some additional edits on this. And I might turn to you, Director Murphy, to sort of frame the discussion for us around this, so that we're really honing in on those areas that deserve commissioner input. I know we had a lot of stakeholder discussion about this very important topic, so I'm calling on you, Director Murphy. Well, I appreciate that, Chair, and I think so. I guess the commissioners have heard that this is of particular importance to me. I've been tracking it pretty closely and working hard on it. And I, for one, learned more through not only, but I would very much focus on Professor Dickinson's testimony. And I think she came forward with some suggestions that staff would like a little bit of time to work through in terms of using the right data sets for the identification of DI communities and trying to get everything focused on that, on the block group instead of the tract, so that we're kind of consistently identifying the right communities. So that's one space where I think we would like to work a little bit harder, and also kind of further enshrine the rules that we put forward as it relates to the definition of disproportionately impacted community. I think that there are probably 3 open questions that I heard from the stakeholders. One is, what is the distance? Staff proposed 2,000 feet. The Conservation Colorado proposed 26, half of a mile. Sorry, I can't do math right now, 2640. Whether to include mobile homes, and from staff's perspective, a mobile home is a type of building unit, so we think we're capturing some of that. And then also whether to include affordable subsidized housing as independent criteria to identify a disproportionately impacted community. So I think that those are 3 decisions that staff needs direction on, to the extent that the commissioners want to go there today. I think the idea of including a disproportionately impacted community plan can make a lot of sense, and so we'd like to take a cut at that. From CDPHE yesterday, or from Commissioner Putnam yesterday, we heard adding an additional 15 days we can work that in and let you all take a look at it, and maybe build out a little bit more in terms of our expectations or more clarity and for the consultation or what we need in the ALA piece. So I think we can work on a number of these topics and bring them back to you, I guess is a long story short. I think the one other piece I neglected to include in the definition that came forward was linguistic isolation. So I think that covers the first bullet point in terms of what we would like to work on if that works for commissioners, and let us take another shot at it. On the community engagement piece, I think that this is a really important tool, and what I would suggest the commissioners consider is that let staff put together a first cut at a community engagement best practices document that the commissioners themselves can then refine, and maybe even refine outside of the rulemaking process, because that to me needs to be an evergreen document that's more flexible than a rule provision. And so that's something that we could even try to bring forward to you kind of in the weeks between our hearings, if that's an okay space. I mean, I kind of think Commissioner McGowan wrote it for us yesterday, but we could probably put a little more content into it, and then working with the folks who are working on the disproportionately impacted community work at CDPHE. We have been working with them, but I think we could probably either provide more support or work more closely with them on that piece as well. So I've talked now in circles perhaps, but that would be my suggested path on this.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Director Murphy. I will now turn it to commissioners. Would someone like to initially engage on this for us? Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that Director Murphy has really captured all of the issues pretty well. I think the only thing that I know has come up in other aspects of, both ALA and cumulative impacts about the presence of other oil and gas locations. I would just want staff to take some additional consideration or just thought on how to handle the presence or perhaps density of existing oil and gas locations when there's a proposal in or near a DI community. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yes, and Director Murphy's shaking her head as well in an up and down fashion, as opposed to a not sideways fashion. So that's good. Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one detailed piece, but important to us, is I think in the most recent draft, there was some differences in the amount of time provided for different agencies for consultation. I think CPW had 60 days. I think we had 45 and some other agencies had 45. I think it probably makes sense to make those all common at 60. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Other commissioners desiring to weigh in on these topics?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Gonzalez.
So I've been thinking a lot about this, the DI communities and how we address that. Hugely important to me. I think it's hugely important to Coloradans, and definitely has been a miss and been a neglected piece of the equation for way too long. I love the idea of an evergreen development of this policy, right? We're going to learn a lot as we start implementing it, as we get more information about the communities that are around oil and gas developments. And I think it's really important that we continue to fill that data and let that be our guide as we apply best management practices, recommendations, possibly even requirements to operators in the future. There was the suggestion for the DI communities plan, which I think is actually a really good idea. And what I'm thinking there is that if you allow kind of an open-ended with some, hey, here's the hit list of what you need to address, opportunities for operators to come up with their plan. Many of these operators know their communities very well. And if they're required to understand them at a deeper level that specifically goes to equity and specifically goes to impacts of communities that have potentially a lesser voice as it currently stands, I think you might find that some operators are doing X, other operators are doing Y, others are doing Z, and you can leverage that just as you do with technology and siting processes into what could be the best overall plan or the best overall practices to really apply statewide with a more tailored way of doing it based on how each of these affected communities is impacted. So I know I was rambling to say, yes, Director Murphy, I like what you're saying, but I really want to keep that theme alive of evergreen nature, of looking at as much input as we can, and allowing the diversity of input from the different operators who know their communities, but at the same time provide kind of, hey, you got to look at census data, you got to look at the American Community Surveys data, you've got to identify the most common languages and have materials that address that, kind of a general high level hit list, but then how they go about it kind of allow that to be developed along the way.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. I agree. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. One additional thought related to all of that is just the idea that maybe there's additional incentives or requirements for mitigation when we're looking at a location that's somewhat proximate to a DI community. So yeah, I think just, both whether it's emissions related or, other types of things that they can do to just kind of mitigate the impacts. And again, I think I mentioned this when we're talking about alternative location analysis. I would like to see that being, more direct mitigation as opposed to, compensatory mitigation. So just something at least to maybe for you all to noodle on, and definitely would defer and trust all of you in terms of how that might look.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Commissioner McGowan.
Mr. Chair, yeah, I think the director did a nice job of summarizing some of the things that we wanted to see included, and I'm fine with it being an evergreen policy. For me, the emphasis also is on meaningful dialogue and response to that dialogue, not just we had a meeting and people talked and we took notes and then we walked away. I think the idea of meaningful communication is collaboration and problem solving together. And so I'm hoping to see some sort of emphasis on that piece, the follow-up and the continued dialogue. Not, I checked a box, I had a public meeting and now I'm done.
A very good point. Commissioner Putnam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I won't repeat the great points from my fellow commissioners about how critical this element is. I just wanted to focus on the evergreen piece. That means we really should make sure that we continue the engagement with our DI team and our Office of Health Equity at CDPHE, along with other state agencies, federal agencies, or others who are working in this area. Because I think one of the challenges that communities often face is lots of different representatives of government, small g, wearing different hats, coming in with different problems, using different processes. And the more that we can think about things holistically and have some degree of commonality and really pick up everybody's game on this point, I think will be really good. So we should make sure that evergreen document for CDPA or COGCC is evergreen for everybody, and that we continue up that engagement.
I'm muted. Thank you, Commissioner Putnam. Director Murphy, it seems like you've done a good job of capturing these thought processes. It looks like staff has direction to further engage a little bit on this and bring this back to us. Are there areas that need further attention from your perspective?
Chair, the areas I would like direction are the distance question, and that could certainly wait till we bring this back to you all. I think and to me, the places to have pretty direct guidance now that would be helpful are whether to include as a specific criteria to identify a disproportionately impacted community, whether that should include mobile home parks, subsidized affordable housing, and linguistic isolation. I think those were the 3 additions that were proposed.
You're taking a swing at that. What if we were to include that where the director deems it necessary? Commissioner Gonzalez?
You know, I'd prefer to have more, you know, more hard bounds on specifically any kind of ways we identify what's going to trigger that ALA with regards to specific distances. And so in that regard, you know, I don't know that I want to leave it up to the director's discretion, just strictly to, it's got to be this far in this case, this far in this case. That's really one of the things that I'm concerned about with that suggestion. Additionally, I'd be curious about if there's uniform identification processes for what a mobile home park is. Like I think conceptually I know what a mobile home park is, but does everybody, and is everyone going to apply that definition uniformly? Is there, you know, I'd like to have a specific definition for subsidized affordable housing and how that's determined. And then for the linguistic isolation, I don't know if that's a specific trigger for an ALA or maybe something that should be considered more in the DI plan. And so specifically to your question, Director Murphy, on kind of distance, what we include as triggers with that distance. I need more definition on that, on how we can make that more clear. And I think the distance that we have currently is appropriate, and with some exceptions, you know, has a lot of consensus through the testimony we've heard thus far.
Thank you, Commissioner Gonzalez. My understanding from review of the testimony is that DOLA, Department of Local Affairs, has a publicly available database on mobile home parks, and so I think that could provide kind of that public accessibility piece. And then also Colorado Housing and Finance Authority has some information on subsidized affordable housing, and so we can I know that my recollection is that that's what the stakeholder or the party who is really putting forward these modifications had cited us to, and our staff can take a look at those and bring that forward if we think it makes sense, or at least articulate why we didn't if we disagreed, and let commissioners then make a decision.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Murphy, could we maybe look also at whether or not, so I think as part of all these discussions, we talked about income, and it sounded to me like we were unsure that was easily readily available data or not. Can you remind me?
So where staff's definition proposed 3 components for disproportionately impacted community. 2 of those were at the block group level. 1 was at the tract level because the organization FFEIC only did that data at the tract level. There is income, and I'm a little bit over my skis here because this has been an ongoing conversation among staff in the background over the last few days. But my understanding is, and this is where I'd like to follow up with Professor Dickinson in particular, is that there is an organization that has income at the block group level, but it doesn't kind of pick it doesn't pick low, moderate, high. And we've been really leery about being in the driver's seat of picking low, medium, high. And so I think one of the conversations we've had, and this is what we would want to bring back to you all and articulate this as our thinking, is that if we use the existing FFEC salary or income levels to apply to the other data set, does that get us as a commission out of the business of picking high, medium, low? In terms of using what somebody else in their expertise has developed as the criterion, and then the data from a different subset, and kind of meld those together to get this block group data. And this is a really messy explanation because again, it's been like in the background, and I know it's happening at the staff level, and I've been checking in kind of, but that's one of the things we're thinking about, and hopeful with a little bit of time we can perhaps delve into that or call upon the expertise of some of the folks who've presented to us.
Thank you, Director. So I think the reason I'm asking is, instead of us pointing out to specific types of housing communities, that income might be a surrogate for that. And so I wouldn't mind us exploring a little bit with the folks who know and understand this, if income might be a different way for us to get that, rather than identifying certain types of housing. And if we can't, then I think the housing might be an appropriate surrogate. One could be a surrogate for the other. So income probably also is a good way for us to slice and dice an impacted community with, fewer resources.
I don't know if it's possible, but I'll talk to our GIS folks about trying to get kind of overlays. That's a huge ask, so I probably shouldn't have even said it out loud, but
sorry, I think what I'm saying is, if we figure out the income piece, I don't know if we have to put in if you live in a trailer park or a mobile home park, or public housing, income might cover those already. There's a part of me that says we should add them because it feels more common sense, but then there's a part of me that says if we're starting to pick and choose specific types of living spaces, are we going to miss something? And then it feels like we're specifically picking certain things out. So I don't have enough background on it to know if I don't have enough background information to decide. And that's not our expertise, and I know that it's not COGCC's at this point either. So
let us work on that, Commissioner, and kind of look at the interplay between the two pieces. And I would ask, actually, that's not a directive. That was a question.
Thank you for this discussion. Commissioner Nanjapa?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, along these lines, I think, based on what was mentioned, what is available, that these are probably in some sort of spatial data set that could be fairly easily overlaid. And I would be interested, as you're kind of looking at it, to see how much we would or wouldn't have missed, doing it one way versus another, or if that could be sort of commented perhaps in the SVP. But I think that, there should be a way to look at that. I would agree that it seems that income could be a surrogate. And I know that was kind of the gist of what was previously, being looked at. But I think that, just sort of doing a little bit of a test there could be useful. And then regarding the language isolation, I think I lean a little bit more the way that Commissioner Gonzalez was mentioning, that perhaps that goes into the DI community plan, and more specifically into the best management practices for community engagement. And that perhaps that is some sort of, data layer that you look at, but in those instances, it provides just that trigger to then, make sure you're seeking the additional language services or that the operator is engaging in those ways or something. Just thinking out loud, but again, appreciate you and the staff taking a closer look at those things.
Thank you, Commissioner Nanjapa. Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm trying to make sure that I'm following here, and I appreciate the conversation, and I mean, this is obviously incredibly important. Generally speaking, are we talking about triggers for an ALA? I mean, I understand that there's the DIC plan, and that's one piece, but then there's triggers to the ALA. And as we're talking about income, we're talking about mobile home parks, we're talking about affordable housing. These are being considered as potential triggers to an ALA, the way that I understand it. And so I guess as I'm trying to picture this situation. Right now, we've got a 2,000-foot trigger to a building unit, residential unit. Well, let's just say building unit within a DIC. And I'm trying to understand situations on the ground that would be, that there would be an affordable housing complex or a mobile home complex or some situation that wouldn't be captured, you know, in that 2,000 feet, or even if we went to 2,640 feet, which was suggested by some stakeholders. I mean, ultimately here, we're trying to figure out what triggers an ALA. And I think maybe we're trying to overcomplicate this a little bit, because it may just be, you know, making sure that we kind of analyze that if we had this 2,000 feet or we had this 2,640 feet, that would require an ALA, which is additional information for analysis and review purposes, whether or not that would capture, you know, all these different micro elements that we're talking about here right now.
Chair, may I? Fortunately, you're muted, but I can kind of read your lips, so I'm just going to take that as permission.
Yeah.
So,
Director Murphy.
thanks. Commissioner Mesner, as I see it, staff is trying to refine the definition of disproportionately impacted community to ensure that we're capturing an ALA in the right circumstances, and also so that when we're building out the 2A, that we also have the opportunity to capture what a disproportionately impacted community engagement plan should look like. So I think that there are two substantive components. Commissioner Njapa has put forth kind of a third one that's a little bit less fleshed out around are there substantive expectations that go along with the disproportionately impacted community plan, and that's something that I need more time to think about, but I think that I think you've asked the right framework question of we need to define it so that we know when an ALA is required and also when a disproportionately impacted community plan would be required. That's the framework staff is planning to present to you or is working towards presenting to you in a couple of days.
Commissioner Messer, follow up? Any other follow up from any of the commissioners on these topics? I would like to recognize that Commissioner Tim Mock, Deputy Director with DNR, has joined us, and we welcome having you with us as a representative for Commissioner Gibbs. Good to see you, Commissioner Mock.
Thanks, commissioners. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'll just be filling in when Angela and Executive Director Dan Gibbs is not available, but a long-time listener, a first-time caller.
Awesome. Okay, Director Murphy, do you and staff feel like you've gotten the direction necessary for the follow-up on this important topic?
Yes, Chair, thank you.
Great.
And thanks for the latitude to let us give it a whirl.
I think it's awesome, a very important topic, and we'll look forward to seeing back. And just for our stakeholders information, we have 134 stakeholders on the phone. I'll just reiterate what we're doing and where we are and where we're going. Yesterday, we started deliberations on the 300 series. This morning, we re-engaged. We have a list of identified issues from commissioners that we developed yesterday. Director Murphy is doing a fine job of helping us work through that list. What we decided we would do is to work through the list of big ticket issues, give direction to staff, allow staff an opportunity to make some red line edits consistent with the direction from commission, get that back from staff. We'll probably figure out a way to get that posted so that everyone can see staff's suggested red line edits consistent with direction. And then sometime during the latter part of next week, we would re-engage on 300 and try to get to conceptual consensus on these issues. So we would take a break from 500 or for 600, wherever we may be. We're trying to be nimble here. And so that's where we're at. So that's a recap, sort of a 7th inning stretch recap of where we are. At this point, I think we're going to move to some of the more one-off thematic legal questions. And if commissioners are comfortable with this, I probably would like to turn to AAG Minor to sort of set the stage for some of these questions. These are questions, thoughts that some of the parties brought out. So with that, thank you for visually appearing there, Attorney General Minor. If you don't mind, could you sort of provide some perspective on some of these thematic legal questions?
Certainly, Mr. Chair, and I am happy to provide you with staff's position on each of these legal issues. Of course, as you all know, Mr. Davenport is your counsel, commission counsel, and so you should interpret my advice in the context of being staff's position, and also, of course, rely on Mr. Davenport as appropriate, given that he is your counsel. But
so
I will
I'll just would suggest to Mr. Davenport, I know he's listening in, why don't you be prepared to sort of weigh in after we hear from Attorney General. Thank you, Mr. Davenport. So we'll look forward to hearing from both attorneys. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So turning first to the use of the term necessary, as I understand the argument of the parties who have raised this, they pointed out that in one part of the statute, which we often think of as sort of the mission change provision, so that's CRS 3460 106 2.5a, which directs that the commission shall regulate oil and gas operations in a reasonable manner to protect and minimize adverse impacts. We do hear the word reasonable, but we do not see the term necessary. However, that statutory provision includes the term minimize adverse impacts, and in turn, the statute in section 103 subpart 5.5 defines the term minimize adverse impacts. And it defines minimize adverse impacts as, quote, means to the extent necessary and reasonable. So from that, we can see that although the word necessary does not actually appear in section 2.5, 106 subpart 2.5a, by using the definition of minimize adverse impacts, that defined term, the term necessary actually does come in through that definition. And so based on that, wherever staff have proposed a rule that is intended to minimize adverse impacts and in fact uses the term minimize adverse impacts, staff has included both the term necessary and the term reasonable, which comes from that statutory definition. Turning next to the definitions of avoid, minimize, and mitigate, staff has proposed definitions of those terms. However, staff proposed those definitions in the 1200 series rules rather than in the 300 series rules. And the reason for that is that the term minimize adverse impacts is actually already defined in the Commission's 100 series rules, but that definition is in the context of protecting wildlife resources and the environment. And so this is really just an artifact of staff's process, but because that was sort of part of the wildlife considerations in the past, staff went ahead and worked on those definitions in the context of the wildlife rules and did in fact broaden them to include the full list of resources that are found in 106 2.5a. So public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. So those definitions are much broader than wildlife, but staff worked on them in the 1200 series. As a result, staff would propose that the Commission also consider those definitions in the context of the 1200 series, and that is not because you have to. Certainly the notice for the 200 through 600 series rulemaking does include revisions to the 100 series rules, but some parties did really only address those proposed definitions in the context of their 1200 series pre-hearing statements, whereas other parties did address the definitions in their 200 through 600 series pre-hearing statements. And staff's position is that it would be a little bit fairer to the parties who sort of held their fire and decided to wait until the series where staff had proposed the definitions to address them, to just do that in the 1200 series. So again, you are not legally bound to only consider those definitions there. It is part of the notice for the 200 through 600 series rulemaking to address all 100 series definitions, but staff would prefer that you do so when we get to the 1200 series later in September. Moving on to the presumption of approval or the presumption of denial, as it has been framed by some parties. As I discussed during staff's closing statement yesterday, the proposed Rule 510A that we will hear more about from Ms. Larson later today during staff's presentation on the 500 series is very clear that the proponent of a commission order always bears the burden of proof. And so the proponent of an order for an oil and gas development plan would be the operator, the permit applicant, but the same would hold true for example, commission staff when they propose that the commission take enforcement action. The burden of proof is on staff in that case. So there is no presumption of approval or presumption of denial built into the rules. Rather, what is built into the rules is that the person seeking something from the commission, so in this case, a permit applicant, would always bear the burden of proof that they comply with all of the rules necessary to obtain the permit, as well as all criteria of the Act. And so any case where perhaps the Act, this actual statutory provisions are a little broader than the Commission's rules, the applicant would need to demonstrate compliance with the Act as well. Staff, as a practical matter, in the course of reviewing permit applications, really does that from a position of neutrality. Staff is not going in assuming that the operator will meet the criteria to get the permit. It's not going in and assuming that the operator will not. It is really just objectively reviewing the permit application according to all rule provisions and statutory provisions. And then last but certainly not least, the question of both the director's discretion and the commission's discretion was raised by many parties. Staff's position is that wherever the commission delegates authority to the director throughout the rules, there are reasonable criteria to restrain that authority. The Oil and Gas Conservation Act does, as I mentioned in my opening statement, does certainly authorize the commission to delegate its authority to the director where appropriate. The Colorado Administrative Procedure Act contemplates that all boards and commissions will have the option to ensure that their staff are able to carry out their orders. And so that is just sort of a necessary way that government has to work, right? The five of you can't make every day-to-day decision that the commission has to make. And staff believes that it has complied with all of the lawful requirements for those delegations of authority by providing clear criteria and guideposts wherever the director is making a decision. So if you look at Rule 306, for example, the director's recommendation on an oil and gas development plan, that includes numerous criteria and bounds on that discretion. So it does include the necessary and reasonable clause we already talked about. It includes the term minimize adverse impacts, which is defined in the statute to include numerous criteria that we've all heard: public health, safety, welfare, and the environment, wildlife resources. And then of course, the director's recommendation on a permit application also needs to ensure that the operator has complied with all of the rules throughout the 300 series. So in a way, everything in rules 303, 304, and 305 are all criteria guiding the director's discretion there. So I think that is probably good enough for my overview for now. I'm of course happy to answer questions and also to turn it over to Mr. Davenport to the extent he has anything to add or disagree with what I said.
Thank you, Attorney General Minor. Attorney General Davenport, do you have any additional thoughts, me too's, otherwise, as we sort of frame the discussion on these legal issues?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with everything that AG Minor said. The standards of necessary and reasonable do come in the definition of minimize adverse impacts. Just a couple of things to point out in addition to what Mr. Minor said. The APA itself sets the requirement that the proponent of an order has the burden of proof, and Rule 510 is consistent in that manner. I'll also point out that the licensing provisions of the APA do state that a license shall be granted solely on the criteria, terms, and purposes of the statute or regulations promulgated thereunder. And so that's where the statutory requirements also come in terms of granting a license.
Thank you, Attorney General Davenport. Turning to commissioners on these issues, do we want to just sort of take them in order? Do folks have thoughts, comments about the necessary issue that was raised by certain of the parties? Commissioner Najaba.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, you know, in that when that came up, I looked into the different sections that folks had mentioned in their comments, and they all, unless I missed something, seem to tie into that necessary and reasonable, which I knew was part of the act. So I just wanted to just express appreciation for AAG Minor and AAG Davenport for providing that additional explanation here. So with that, I'm comfortable leaving those words as they are.
Okay, I'm seeing nodding of heads on that. The definition of avoid, minimize, and mitigate. I appreciate the point that Attorney General Minor said that, you know, while we have heard from some of the parties on this, others of the parties are awaiting wildlife 1200 series to further brief us on this. Seems to me that that makes some sense, that we should, you know, dive into the issues around those definitions at the time that we've heard from everyone. Are there thoughts about that from commissioners? Okay. Presumption of approval. That was an issue I threw on the table. I feel good having heard from our AGs about that we sufficiently identified the sea change and we have within our abilities the ability to deny when appropriate. And I don't necessarily believe there is a presumption of approval. I believe that we have done and staff has done, and we are getting to a neutral regulatory playing field, which is what I think 181 is telling us to do. So I'm comfortable that we can, you know, sort of strike that off the list as not being an issue, because it's not an issue, that the rules are correctly identified as neutral. Does anyone have further thoughts around that issue?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Manjot.
I'm also comfortable with the explanation. That said, I think there's, you know, this great collaborative conversation that happens between the commission and the operators, you know, when things are not quite to a point where they can approve something, and this back and forth and give and take. But that's not visible, I think, to a lot of our stakeholders. And so I'm wondering if there could be some consideration of, I'm struggling with this a little bit, so I'm thinking out loud, you know, because I also don't want to create undue burdens for the staff, but it could, you know, maybe there could be some sort of notice of conditional approval, or, you know, something that goes out so that folks know that there was, as submitted, it was not, you know, it didn't meet the conditions needed to approve, but there was going to be additional dialogue with the operator to, you know, to allow for that. Anyway, so I think I'm just thinking about perhaps there's an opportunity to increase some transparency in that process.
I think that, and I appreciate that comment, Commissioner Najapa, and I'll defer to Director Murphy and AAG Minor, but I think that some of that will get brought forward in guidance documents from staff about how the processes that we create and rules are going to work. So we have statute, we end up implementing it through rules, and then we have guidance documents that staff puts together that sort of shows the regulated community as well as stakeholders how to be involved and what the process looks like. So that's kind of my initial thought on that, with my former director hat on, but I would look to Director Murphy potentially to speak to this issue as well.
Thanks, Chair. And I do think thinking about how we can do it in strictly the permitting context is something we can look a little bit at and maybe come back to you with. I mean, it's kind of like I'm getting a little bit lost in like the functionality of our database and how that works. And so I would need a little bit of time with both the subject matter experts who are actually engaging in that back and forth and evaluating whether a permit achieves the rules objectives, and an understanding of kind of like that, the other component of that process in the database. But I kind of put it in the SBP kind of flag of like, how do we do this for further exploration? And we can come back as appropriate.
Commissioner Nanjapa, does that provide you an appropriate solution approach on the issue you've raised?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think so. You know, like I said, I'm kind of still thinking out loud with this and just trying to think of you know, it seems like that came up a lot in the feedback we received from the public about this, you know, presumption of approval and this appearance, you know, or the optics of everything going forward. But, you know, now having talked with the staff and heard from all of you, you know, over the last several weeks, it's clear that there is a lot of back and forth and dialogue to improve the conditions to allow for approval. And that's the part of it that I just think is there's a potential opportunity there to think about how we could be more transparent. And I appreciate the comments, you know, from Director Murphy about how that could happen. So yeah, I think that would be great to just, you know, see what you and the staff would come forward with.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I appreciate this. I think just from my experience, you know, reviewing, you know, different permits for land use changes, there's always, you know, changes that happen through a land use review process, and there's modifications. And there's also a misconception, whether it's a, you know, a housing subdivision or a asphalt batch plant or a gravel pit or an oil and gas operation, that the review or regulatory agency always approves permits. There's never a denial. But the reality is that through that process, you know, I think if the process is good and the application evolves through the process. That is what a land use process does, is it evolves that application until it can get to a point where it can be approved versus just denying it and starting over. And so that doesn't mean that every land use application gets approved. There's certainly denials in every, I can think of every circumstance where I've had denials in different land use applications, but there's always a process that helps evolve that application in order to get it to, you know, a better place once it ultimately may get approved or denied. I think that the bullet that Director Murphy put down there, which is to figure out how to create that transparency, is important, and whether that's you know, a document or findings, or, you know, some way to show how this application has evolved, you know, as before it comes to the commission or before it becomes as a recommendation. I think that is important, and that could happen through findings or some document that documents the evolution of that. But that's just my thoughts on that.
Chairman Robbins, may I jump in with a comment on that?
Yes.
So Commissioner Messner, I think you're absolutely right in the evolution of the application materials. And I'd just like to point out that our staff diligently documents the changes and modifications that we make to a permit that we are reviewing. As Director Murphy said earlier, you know, the operator certifies that what they're submitting to us is true and to the best of their knowledge accurate. Our staff then conducts our review. And so any changes that we see need to be made, whether it's a distance to a cultural feature, or they've listed the wrong soil type, our staff documents that those changes had to be made on the way through the process. So I just wanted to point out that record is established, and we will certainly continue, you know, on the director's behalf to document those changes before we make a recommendation to the commission.
Thank you, Mr. Geronimo. Good points, well taken.
Thanks for letting me jump in.
Yep. Any other commissioners with thoughts on this? All right then. Should we move Director Murphy to the last little bucket or two before taking a short break and then jumping into the 500 series? Okay, so 2A questions, stronger consideration of ALA, access roads and emergency plans. Director Murphy, do you want to clue us into what you drafted up here so that we can frame the discussion? I think the concept of, do we want water plans or geohazard plans? Do we want to add in biologic resource plans to wildlife? Those are pretty self-evident. I'm not quite sure about the first two bullets. And maybe it's just because I'm hungry for lunch.
All possible. I think that my understanding of the stronger consideration of the ALA is maybe how does the ALA shape consideration of the 2A, or what's its role in the 2A, maybe is a better way to frame it. And I don't recall which commissioner raised it, so I can't add much more color on that. And then on the access roads, I think that I personally think that the access roads and emergency management plan are something that we will work out with this close coordination collaboration with local governments. Yeah. I think that I know that our team has spent time digging into the questions around water plans and did a deep dive into the Pennsylvania piece that was brought forward, and can offer some thoughts on that if it would be helpful. We've also looked into kind of some of the geohazard stuff and could talk a little bit about it. But again, I think on geohazards, or what we're doing addresses it. On water plans, I think what we think is that information from the Pennsylvania piece could provide really helpful guidance. But our rules, and as they stand, really accomplish what they need. On wildlife and biological resources plan, the question of biological resources is something that has come up. We spent quite a bit of time addressing it in the SPP, and Joel will immediately know what pages, and I of course don't. But I know it's there because I've read it and looked at it. But I think that the SPP may be something that we should all take a little bit of time on the biological resources before we come back, because it frames how staff has approached the question of biological resources. And to really simplify it, we think that it's the entire suite of the rules that exist today that we are proposing that you implement that protect biological resources by considering impacts to surface, wildlife, water, air. That helps broaden out the protection for wildlife and biological resources by looking to things like eliminating noxious weeds and seed mixes. We're creating the habitat for pollinators. So like these are the pieces that come together. And again, like I know AAG Joel Miner has been working closely with another one of our PhDs, Dr. Denise Arthur, on this point in particular, and can dive in at any level of detail that you would like. But I guess on water plans, geohazard, and wildlife and biological resources, I would articulate that I think where we are today is great, and we can look to refine each of those pieces through guidance. And so then, to me, the one from this that's most important to get direction from the commission on is the first one. But this is me starting to advocate. So I should probably pull that back a little bit.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you for setting the stage for the consideration of these more discrete topics for us. You know, I'm still not sure I understand stronger consideration of ALA. I think that it is within our rule. I think that we debated and discussed the concept of the importance of the alternative location analysis yesterday, and I think that that's strongly within our regulations. I'm not sure who brought up access roads and emergency management plans, but with my former hat on as a local government lawyer, this is entirely the thing that local governments do a good job of. You know, they are the first responders, and they go and find the appropriate fire management company or emergency company, and almost to a T requires that the emergency management plan is endorsed by the responder, whose jurisdiction is there, and much, if not most, of the access roads are, local government roads, and so, I'm comfortable with that. And then, just my 2 cents, I'm comfortable with staff's suggestion that there's not a need for additional changes to where we've landed so far with the water or the need to add additional biological resources. And I'm comfortable if staff says that currently and historically we addressed geologic hazards, then I, take you at your word on that. So those are my sort of high level 2 cents on these topics. And I'm looking to see what other commissioners are thinking on each of these or all of these topics. Commissioner Nanjapa.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I think we kind of got to the ALA question with our conversation yesterday, although I will admit I don't remember exactly if we landed anywhere with respect to, I know we decided not to require a particular number of alternate locations, or I don't know if we decided that, but we at least discussed that perhaps we don't need to go there. But I think this was tied to whether every 2A should always have some sort of ALA as part of it. And unless I'm understanding incorrectly, the way it works currently is that an ALA may be requested after the 2A is submitted, but it's not part of the submission. So that's a first part question. And then I had a second thing related to access roads, but I'll pause there.
Sorry, I was muted. Director Murphy.
Can I make sure I understand your question, Commissioner? And it's a little bit about the process. So if a 2A comes in and by the operation of the rules, an ALA is not required, and the director requests it, does it become part of that 2A? Or have I?
No, I think we had some conversation as to whether an ALA should be part of, that an operator would have conducted as part of their application, within 2A. And I'll look to the other commissioners. I know there was some conversation about that, and this is what I was saying. I don't know if we landed anywhere. I don't recall for sure on that point. I knew we decided, or at least discussed, that we didn't need to impose a requirement on the number of alternate locations. But what I thought we were kind of dancing around was whether or not we'd want to have every 2A include an alternate location analysis. But I would look to my other fellow commissioners to correct me if I'm wrong here.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is that if an application hits one of the triggers, then an ALA would be required.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't hit one of the triggers, then an ALA would not be required. And that would be a standard application process. So triggers, yes; no triggers, no. And I don't think we've totally landed on what those triggers are yet. And there's still discussion as far as what those triggers are, as far as distances and some other elements. But there is no question that if it hits a trigger, it has to be a part of the submittal, the way I understand it.
I agree. That's my understanding as well. And I think we've also tabled the consideration of are the 10 triggers the appropriate triggers, because we wanted to hear some of the science around setbacks, which will help inform us on that discussion. Commissioner Gonzalez.
Yeah, I agree with what Commissioner Messner's interpretation of what we've heard so far and kind of where we've landed so far is, with 2 exceptions. One is that if there's no ALA trigger, the director can still require or request an ALA. So if there's something kind of out of the ordinary, very unique about the OGDP or the location itself that triggers the director or staff's concern, that they could request that. And then additionally, if there is an ALA trigger, the director can also waive the requirement for that ALA if there's some sort of supporting evidence or or whatever that that relieves or alleviates, should I say, the concern that the director and staff have in regards to the potential need for an ALA in those circumstances. So I think that the ALA are required when there's triggers with that exception, and the ALAs are not required when there's no triggers with the exception.
Commissioner Messner.
And I agree, Commissioner Gonzalez. That's where it is right now as written. I don't know. I think we were tabling some of the discussions around director discretion there. And so that's where it is as written in the draft rules right now. But I think we, at least I think we intend to have further discussions about director discretion in that particular situation and whether that is appropriate or not appropriate. My understanding on that one.
Yeah, and if I could, I recall hearing from the allied local governments, what I thought seems somewhat reasonable is that you won't know whether it's a good idea to waive an ALA until you've sort of gone through the ALA process. And so, that group at least sort of suggested that we ought not, if you meet a trigger, you ought to do the ALA, and there ought not be a waiver of that. So I think we need to, that should be part of the discussion when we finish up on ALAs. At least that's my thoughts about that. Commissioner Najapa.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate all of those clarifications from Commissioner Messner and Commissioner Gonzalez in terms of the understanding of where we are and what we discussed. I think, so that I'm comfortable now with all of that being clarified for me. I appreciate that. As I've mentioned before, I'm a little slow on the uptake sometimes. So I think the other issue, I think I was the one who raised the access road issue. And so I'm thinking about it. The particular testimony was with respect to the distance from the well pad of the access road, with respect to, in the case of an emergency, how the residents were going to have to get out, and the access roads for the emergency vehicles and all those kinds of things. So I don't think we specifically talked about distance from, but I think, I guess that would just be, and I would again, defer to you and staff's discretion there in terms of how this would look, but totally agreeing and understanding that this is the local government authority and the part of that sort of consultation or discussion, collaboration with the local government. But just maybe taking into consideration that where the access roads are located in proximity to the residences, et cetera.
Chair, may I?
Yes, Director.
So a couple of things, Commissioner Najapa. I'll add a note on this topic. My staff has very graciously reminded me that the words I chose on this slide are not as precise as they should be. And so I'm going to correct the words on the screen a little bit to better describe the balance of oversight between us and locals, in that locals are really working on the access routes on public roads. And when we talk about access roads, those are the lease roads, or the roads that are purely on location. And so I wanted to add that clarity, and then we'll add a note maybe for the SBP for us to take a look at kind of the consideration of access roads, and I'm using the term specifically access roads now in terms of proximity to buildings or residences maybe.
Thank you for that.
I guess sorry, Mr. Chair, may I?
Yes, please.
On that point, just less distance or proximity of the access roads to the buildings, but proximity of the access roads to the oil and gas development. Yeah, okay, just clarifying.
Other commissioners with thoughts on this set of issues? Director Murphy, AAG Minor, are you comfortable with the direction you've received at this point?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Commissioner McDonald.
Sorry, can I just add two thoughts, and maybe staff can help me a little bit. So again, I'm guessing that there's going to be connections to the 900 series. I keep saying all the good stuff is in the 900 series. So I feel like what we've been hearing from some folks who have been testifying is, one, they're concerned about the quantity of water that it takes for this activity. And related to that, the viability of reusing water instead of using fresh water every time. And so I understand that we have a waste management plan has more fleshed out requirements in the 900 series. And then we have a water plan that has a part C that just says, if recycled or reused water is anticipated to be used, describe the source and the anticipated volumes. So, and maybe someone can explain to me that maybe this discussion of wastewater and how it's being used and where it's going and why it's not being reused for certain purposes is addressed in the 900 series. Maybe that would help me, or how it's addressed in the 900 series, or maybe it isn't. And is there a possibility if it's in the water plan, instead of us asking about is recycled or reused water anticipated, could we also ask why the operator isn't anticipating recycling their water or reusing it? And if those are all bad ideas, staff, feel free to back me off the boat.
Commissioner, I think that's a question that lands in my wheelhouse, but I want to make sure I understand the first part of your question. And so could I ask you to kind of reframe the first part? And I apologize for taking you back there.
So I think if I understood some of the testimony correctly and some of the pre-hearing statements, that people are worried about the quantity of water that it takes to do this. And so wanting to ensure that operators had some sort of a plan in place to reduce their water usage. And I think that link is to the reused and recycled water. And whether or not we then, as we're looking at applications, can see that there's some sort of thought process or a plan put in place by the operator to be thinking about reducing the quantity of water that they use and then reusing. That's the first part. And then the second part is, I think that there's interest from folks to understand what's happening to the wastewater when there is wastewater. And so my guess is, and again, my guess is that perhaps that's addressed in the waste management plan in the 900 series. So if you could connect the dots for me, that would be helpful.
Okay.
Mr. Drama.
Yeah, thank you. The water management plan is, as you've said, the sources of water that will be used for the development, and would include freshwater sources, municipal water sources, recycled E&P waste, exploration and production waste, produced water, and now under the modifications to Reg 84, potentially reclaimed water from a municipal source. And, so all of those are then, the use of all those are ultimately reported to us on the Form 5A following the completion. So we do track down the precise quantities on the back end. So the plan is telling, generally what their expectations are. We have access to a certain amount of water sources, and we expect to use this, this sort of blend of those various sources of water as needed. With respect to what happens to the waste at the end of the day, E&P waste doesn't, it could be treated and reused. It could be treated and reused a number of times. On the West Slope, operators use their centralized E&P waste management facilities to manage the water. There's oftentimes water sharing agreements between two operators, where one is producing some wells and somebody nearby is drilling and completing some wells, they need that water. So they'll share the water among each other or between each other. I haven't seen one with more than 2 operators engaged in a single water sharing agreement. And then at the end of the day, that water needs to be disposed. It is E&P waste and needs to be disposed in accordance with our 900 series rules. So primarily the means for disposal is deep well injection under a permitted Class 2 UIC, underground injection control well. There are also opportunities for evaporation, or in some cases under a CDPHE discharge permit, it could be discharged to surface water provided it meets their criteria for that. We have an obligation to oversee the management of that waste and make sure that at the end of the day, that molecule of water, no matter how many times it's been reused in the cycle, it is disposed in a manner that is protective of public health, safety, welfare, the environment, and wildlife resources. And again, as I mentioned, I think most of that, the vast majority winds up being injected as its final disposition. Did that help get you there? Not quite.
Maybe I'm not explaining myself well. I apologize. So what I heard some folks testifying saying is that they would like for there to be a wastewater management plan. And what I'm saying to you is perhaps that is already addressed in the waste management plan. I see you nodding yes. So just for clarification for everybody, that's taken care of in the waste management plan, which is further described in the 900 series, my favorite series.
Yes.
Okay.
And just to add one more point of clarification to that, in the past, a waste management plan has not always been required because our rules are very clear about what you can do with your E&P waste. So unless you are proposing to do something different, such as take it to a different type of disposal facility or engage in a reuse and recycling plan, we didn't require a waste management plan for that. If you were simply producing, having produced water, stored in a tank on site, trucked to an injection well and disposed in the injection well, there's no need for a waste management plan for that in the past, because that followed our rules to the letter, to the letter they were written. Now we're saying, even if you're doing that, you need to tell us that you're doing that with your waste management plan.
Thank you, which I'm very appreciative of, because I think people are looking for some transparency, right? So my second part of my question is it part of our responsibility for the minimizing and all the magical words that we're using around public health, environment, et cetera, for us perhaps to also be asking operators in their water plan why they're not using recycled or reused water as part of their anticipated use? And would it incentivize them to think about, because I also hear in testimony that people are worried about the sheer quantity of water it takes for this activity. So maybe that's not an appropriate place for it to be in the water plan, but I guess I'm trying to make a connection to, trying to think of a good word, to push folks towards activities that minimize impact.
And I think, in a lot of places we intend to develop a guidance document basically for each one of the plans required in 304C. Those are new plans, even the waste management plan is a new plan because it will look different under these new rules. And so we will develop a guidance document and to tell operators that our expectation is that they tell us the why they are or are not using water from certain sources, I think is not an unreasonable piece to put in that guidance.
Thank you. Can I ask one more question, Mr. Chair?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Commissioner McGowan.
Thank you. So I also feel like there's a group that's concerned about the geohazard and whether or not it's actually being taken into account when operators are putting together their plans. And what I hear you saying is that we do have data about that and we do consider it. But to me, maybe there's this link to transparency and folks understanding exactly what it is that we go through and what we consider. And so I hear staff doesn't seem thrilled about a geohazard plan being required as part of all these plans that we're requiring. Is there a way though for us to create some transparency for those folks who feel like they might be affected by landslides or faults somewhere that could be shifted due to operator activity? And I don't know what that might look like, and maybe again it's addressed somehow in the guidance, but it seems to me that that those folks don't see that happening. So I don't know if there's a connection to make or not, and feel free again to back me off the boat if I'm heading down the wrong bunny trail.
Mr.
Chairman, may I? Thank you. So I would say, yes, there is room for us to consider that in these regulations. But I also want to be clear that, obviously Colorado is not a uniform state and geohazards are not distributed uniformly across the state. So, a determination of whether or not a site should have a geohazard plan is, where we draw those lines, I think is important. Now, is it enough for if we made it a statewide requirement for the operator to say there are no geohazards within X miles of this and therefore our plan is, nothing? Or is it better to have it site-specific evaluation and say, oh, a geohazard plan is required here, and there, but it will be to a different level depending on what the hazard is. Where there are coal mine workings, that's one type of issue. Where there are landslide issues on the west slope, or avalanche paths, or steep terrain. And again, I do feel that staff does, look at the comprehensive view of the information we get. So, the slope, the surrounding activities, surrounding operations, surrounding geology, and conduct a level of that evaluation. I do also recognize that as the stakeholders mentioned, to engage, the highest level of engineering geologist or geologic professional to develop that plan in every case is just, to me, seems like that's not the necessary path to go down. But certainly there are probably some cases where they might go there. Okay.
Yeah, I think where it's appropriate, if we can create some transparency and some sort of guidance around when that's appropriate, and creating transparency for those who live in those areas, that would be much appreciated. Maybe there's a way that we can think about that. I think Director Murphy has it down and has explained it well. So.
Okay, Commissioner Nanjapa and then Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, and just to add to that, I wanted to just ask, what is it that we look at now? I know we got a little bit of that explanation from Chris yesterday, Chris Eisinger, but aside from the sort of geologic maps and the hazard analysis, are you looking specifically at things like faults and recent activity and the results of maybe seismicity that's been done around the area? What goes into that evaluation on the staff side?
Mr. Dronline.
Sure, and thanks for the question. So I think we need to be clear also about, what is a surface issue versus a downhole issue. And our engineering group, when looking at the wellbore trajectory, et cetera, would be looking for and evaluating, potential faults in the subsurface. But with respect for the surface issues, if the geologic maps do have faults mapped on them, and we do look at, areas of heavy faulting, for example, the radial faults around the Spanish Peaks area were considered when reviewing oil and gas locations in that area. Coal mine workings, were considered. You heard some about the waste connection pads yesterday. Well, that landfill and one of those pads is actually built over a coal mine, and the operator had to do a significant amount of engineering to make sure that their pad was actually going to be stable in that condition. And again, I mentioned the conductor casing yesterday. They ran additional depths of conductor casing, if I remember correctly, to stabilize that. On the west slope, we've certainly looked at the geologic maps that show landslide areas, and also down in the Raton Basin, the soil types, the Golnar soils down there are prone to sloughing and sliding. They're not very stable, so the operators need to take additional measures to stabilize the sites down in that area. So all of those things are tools available at our disposal to put in, and so it's not one thing, it's that sort of combination of things that go together to form that analysis.
Commissioner Nanjapa.
Thank you, Mr. Geronimo. I appreciate that additional explanation. And I also agree just with Commissioner McGowan that I think just the additional transparency would be helpful based on what we heard.
Commissioner Messner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Maybe a simple solution here, and I think the transparency is important. I think, just having folks know that the evaluations that are occurring is important. But, would it not be simpler just to, because the burden of proof is on the applicant, and so if there was a checkbox on the 2A application that said, is this area, prone to geologic hazard? If they check yes, then it would require a geologic hazard plan. If they check no, then it would not. And then obviously staff would have to evaluate whether that was accurate or not, but it seems like that would be a fairly easy thing to do.
Other thoughts from commissioners? Can I maybe turn it back to Director Murphy?
Yes, it seems like we made it through this slide in my estimation. I think we have good direction. We've had good conversation, and we can work to see how to integrate that, and kind of as I've alluded to fairly generically on this slide. And with that, would offer up, this is, oops, sorry, I didn't actually advance the slide. So this is the final slide I put together last night with some pretty focused issues, and also like that catch-all, what did I miss? What did we want to add to, if that's appropriate? And so I would ask the chair, like, whether we want to power through this. Do we want to take a lunch and come back and try to spend 15 or 20 minutes working through the slide, and then staff can get into 500?
I prefer we take a break and lunch and come back and then power through this in 15 minutes, and then give Ms. Larson the heads up that we're going to then turn to her. Commissioners, thumbs up, thumbs down? I mean, I can also power through it for 15 minutes. Okay, let's take a break. It is 12:08. How much time did we set aside for lunch today? 55 minutes is what's set aside. Commissioners, Does 45 minutes work? Okay. Why don't we do this? Let's come back at 1 o'clock. That's 50 minutes. All right. See you at 1 o'clock. Bye.